Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to be looking at some background information and some contextualizing material in order to better understand the purpose of the first article that we'll be reading in this course, Stripped for Parts. We're going to be taking an overview of some of the objectives that we're going to attempt to complete in this course with respect to both this text and how we're going to use that as a launching pad into the issues that will be concerning us throughout the rest of the course. As we established when we discussed the course outline, this class is oriented around an exploration of ethical issues pertaining to the field into which you're entering, social perspectives on medicine more generally, the kinds of dilemmas, issues, and concerns that might arise in the context of your profession, and a kind of interweaving of all these different areas together. The article that you have to read for this week, Stripped for Parts, is an example of popular science writing. It offers us insight into the way in which certain medical issues and the very profession that you're going to be entering into are being framed and represented in the public consciousness. We'll talk about some of the ways in which the popular representations and media texts help to frame public perception. This is true not just in nonfiction texts like the article that you read for today, but in fact in all the various texts that we'll be looking at over the course of the semester, whether they be nonfiction or fiction. We'll also discuss how fiction can be used as a lens into contemporary issues, both fiction that comes from another time period, like H.G. Wells and his The Island of Dr. Moreau, and contemporary works like Come Thou Tortoise. On the one hand, we have a text that is dealing with issues in the medical community of Wells's day, about 150 years ago, 130 years ago. However, the kinds of societal perspectives that it articulates and presents to us, and the way in which it grapples with that larger, not necessarily conflict, but conversation between the public and the medical community, is applicable to contemporary circumstances because we can extrapolate principles of those interactions that can be applied and used to understand how we engage with the public today. In the terms of Come Thou Tortoise and its reflections on grief, mourning, death, and loss, and the way in which different people experience those things, that is set in an explicitly contemporary context. And again, however, we can still extrapolate those general principles and better understand real-world applications of those ideas through the fictional text. Now, as I've said, one of the things we're going to be focusing on is the depiction of nursing, doctors, and medicine more generally within the public consciousness and in popular media. We're going to be doing that by way of the two novels that we're reading in this course. However, as a kind of example to whet your appetite, to prime your minds for how we'll be approaching these issues, we have the incredibly popular and successful television series from the last decade, House MD. For those of you who have seen it, you know that it is something of a kind of reimagining of Sherlock Holmes in the context of a procedural medical drama. Dr. House, with his addiction, his injury, his analytical mind, some of his antisocial tendencies, is a kind of reimagining of the famed detective. Yet the cases that he takes on are not murder mysteries, but medical ones. In the context of this show, we have a depiction of the medical community and of the approach to the treatment and the diagnosis of ailments that is highly fictionalized, and yet it informs the public perception and consciousness of the way in which hospitals, doctors, and nurses in turn operate. This show is spectacular drama. It is an incredibly well-performed, or was an incredibly well-performed and well-acted series with some quality writing, at least as it pertains to the dialogue and the delivery of the central character, House, this analog for a medical version of Sherlock Holmes. However, as you can see in the article that I've linked in the description for this video that I'd like you to review on an episode review for the very first episode of House, Everybody Lies, the nurse practitioner in these pieces or in these episodes is relegated to a role of irrelevancy. They're scenes or window dressing. The nurse exists. However, all the myriad tasks that the nurse is actually meant to perform in the context of a genuine hospital are performed by the glamorized doctors who seem to be nearly superhuman. Now, this is a problem that persists throughout the entire piece. For instance, you'll see in numerous episodes moments at which the doctors themselves enter into people's homes or conduct field surveys to try to find the various causes of the ailments that have inflicted or that have been inflicted upon the patients that they are treating. So there are a number of intense and, in fact, criminal irrealities to the performance of the doctors in this series. However, the point is not the verisimilitude of the piece. The point is not how true to life this show actually is. Rather, it's how the depiction of the medical community of doctors and nurses in these works can shape public perceptions. What I'd like you to do is pause this video and take a look at the review of the first episode of House that's posted in the description to this video, and then return so that I can offer a few comments on it. Now that you've returned to this video, after having reviewed that article that I asked you to take a look at, one of the things that stands out in the article is quite simply that nurses are almost completely excised from the entire process. As a result, the public consciousness and the public perception of nurses is shifted such that they're no longer valuable components of this much larger collaborative enterprise of healthcare. Instead, they can be seen perhaps as, well, nothing more than, in the language of the show, really incompetence. House at one point says in a particular episode that I don't use nurses, simply because he perceives them to be vastly inferior. They're incapable of doing all the things that the doctors around him, this team of specialized medical professionals that he's assembled in his diagnostic medicine department, are capable of doing. And so he doesn't trust them to carry out their jobs in an adequate fashion. Now, this is largely because House is a horrible curmudgeon and doesn't really trust anyone to perform in a fashion that he deems to be competent. However, that pervasive relegation of the nurse and the denigration of the nurse can enter into the public consciousness and shape the way in which they and people perceive the profession. And I'm not going to delve into House's portrayal of nursing or the profession in depth. However, I merely cite this as an example of the way in which media can frame the role of the nurse and the role of other medical practitioners, contracting or inflating the various different responsibilities that they are meant to assume and that they do assume in their actual profession as we see it in the real world, and thus shape the way in which they will respond to and view the various different kinds of medical practitioners. Now, one of the strengths of House is that it does reflect on some of the ethical issues that surround the medical profession. However, it does not do so in what we might believe to be the most accurate and truthful fashion. It's good, perhaps, at identifying some of the core issues surrounding nursing and surrounding all the various different responsibilities and roles within the medical community. However, it dramatizes them, it reimagines them and reconfigures them. So it's up to the conscientious viewing public to look at these issues that have been glamorized and exaggerated, inflated beyond the norm. It's incumbent upon them to take those issues and then essentially deflate them, to recognize what they would really be like and how the show is perhaps commenting on them or taking tremendous dramatic and narrative license to simply turn these issues that are genuine within the profession into something that is sexy and compelling for a 1-hour drama piece. What we're going to do is take a look at another video clip from an episode of House that illustrates this point. Some things to keep in mind before you watch that video clip. Depictions of the medical community and doctors and nurses in fiction and media, something that we'll be focusing on in both the main text that we're studying in this course, The Island of Dr. Moreau and Come Thou Tortoise, ultimately serve as vehicles for allegory and extrapolation. In other words, when we're looking at these texts, we're not necessarily looking to see how genuine or how true to life the conflicts they present are. However, we look at them as dramatizations or as parallels to contemporary issues. Thus, we can essentially use the texts as windows into those issues and see how those works, these fictions, are commenting on those issues without believing that they have to be genuine or accurate depictions of the things that they're grappling with. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that all these media and fictional depictions of the medical profession or the science surrounding it ultimately affects social commentary. In other words, whether we're dealing with a television show or a contemporary television show like House or a novel like The Island of Dr. Moreau, each of these works is reflecting on the social climate and the issues within the field of medicine at its time. Now, it can do so directly, even if in an exaggerated fashion, as in House, as we'll see in the video clip that I'll present to you, or it can do so by way of a kind of allegorical approach. For instance, in The Island of Dr. Moreau, H.G. Wells, the author of the piece, is actually commenting on the practice of vivisection, which is functionally the dissection of animals for the use of medical experimentation and scientific advancement while the animal is still alive. So you can observe the various different functions of the organelles and the way in which the blood flows through capillaries and veins by actually splaying the animal open and observing how it reacts and how those systems operate while the creature is still alive. Now, H.G. Wells, although the novella deals with this explicitly, extrapolates and goes beyond the issue in itself, as Dr. Moreau, the central character in this work, takes animals and transforms them through processes of vivisection, extrapolating from that scientific process that actually exists in the medical community of Wells' day, and then looks at its application in a more fantastical context, wherein the central character here, Moreau, is taking the animals and refining them, cutting into the flesh and the brains of these creatures, and then transforming them into something, well, that is neither animal nor man through these processes. In either case, whether it's a dramatization of real-world issues or a kind of science fiction allegorization of these issues, the texts are still reflecting on the society and those issues themselves. And it's that reflection, that commentary, that we're going to be concerned with as we go on in this course. In either case, it's a reflection of the societal norms and presumptions. So, for instance, in the context of The Island of Dr. Moreau, we see public outcry against Dr. Moreau's experiments. And we'll discuss this more when we actually get into the novel, but it's just an example. This public outcry is a reflection of changing attitudes towards vivisection in H.G. Wells' time and in the years preceding the development of the novella. However, there's a complex interweaving of media, politics, and perspectives on issues in science, medicine, or culture. And that is that media, in a sense, helps to guide and direct the evolution of culture by normalizing certain things. Right? Just as we saw in House, you can have the relegation of nurses' roles in the public consciousness by having millions of people every week tuning into a show and watching its depiction or its falsified and inaccurate depiction of the profession. Public perception and contemporary events shape and define what actually transpires in the media, but in turn, the media itself helps to normalize certain presumptions within the public consciousness. And it's that interrelationship between the media and public consciousness and the way in which they both frame and perceive both professions and the ethical issues and responsibilities associated with them that we're going to be concerned with in this course. As an example of this, a concrete example, I'd like you to take a look at the video clip from House involving essentially the right to die, or the quote-unquote right to die. I'm not making a kind of moral judgment whether somebody has the right or doesn't have that right. However, that is essentially the issue that's being grappled with in the show. The issue not just in nursing and medicine, but also in policy, politics, and social presumption and perspective. What I'd like you to do is to take a look at that video clip. It's about 8 minutes long, and I'd like you to think about this defining or guiding question or series of questions as you do. What is handled well in the video clip, and what is handled poorly? What are the issues in medicine and ethical concerns addressed? Now, obviously, I've identified the major one because it's in the title of the video. Somebody wants to be allowed to die. What are some of the other issues that are actually undergirding that conversation? How do you judge the way in which they're addressed? And how do you judge the behavior and performance of the patient and the doctors that are caring for him? Use what you have in terms of your professional judgment at this juncture in your education to assess the depiction of these issues and make moral judgments about the conduct of the people involved and the way in which they're handling these issues. Try to answer these questions, and then when you've finished, return to this video, and we'll continue on with our conversation about popular depictions of doctors and nurses in media, and also the article that we're going to return to, Jennifer Cohen's Stripped for Parts. All right. Now, I've said that popular depictions of medicine and nurses and the entire field help to shape public perception. What we'll be doing with the article Stripped for Parts is analyzing how the media in a nonfiction text frames these depictions and use that as a window into how it shapes public perception, or the kinds of values that are instantiated and embedded in those texts that can influence public perception. In order to do that, however, we need to know a few things: how popular science journal articles, like Stripped for Parts, are composed, and the kinds of techniques that they employ so that we can analyze them in context in this specific example. One of the things to keep in mind is that popular science journal articles, and in fact any kind of newspaper article or media article, is ultimately going to rely on a kind of narrativization of events. Rarely will you find a direct relation of facts, of details pertaining to an event. Instead, in most articles or journal articles, you'll be looking at a narrativization wherein the author has the task of taking those factual details and couching them in a narrative context. Human beings generally are not particularly interested in rote facts or in the simple, plainly stated facts of a matter. We need a narrative, a story, to catch our imagination. That's one of the reasons why fictional depictions of the struggles of a doctor or nurse within the context of the ethical issues surrounding the profession are far more compelling to us than a kind of analytical survey of those issues. We want to see the human element. We want to see these questions of the profession or of any issue put into the form of a story that we can grapple with and understand, that makes them palpable and present and real to us. The same is true in nonfiction articles like Stripped for Parts. As you have seen, if you start to read the article, the story involved is actually about, well, one reporter's night inside the hospital as a body is being kept alive for eventual organ harvesting. That kind of narrativization helps to ground the otherwise potentially dull or dry facts of the scientific processes or the medical processes involved in the article or described in the article. In order to understand the basic principles of narrativization, I'm going to talk briefly about narrative structure. Now, this is a gross oversimplification of narrative structure, and it refers to one of the most simplistic forms of narrative, that being the three-act structure. But the conversation here is merely designed to provide you with a representative example of a basic narrative structure that could be applied in one of these articles. Such a structure follows three acts, or three major segments. So you have Act 1, which is the setup for the narrative, where it establishes certain basic principles and premises of the work. Act 2 is the confrontation, where some kind of problem or issue is introduced. And Act 3 is the resolution to that central confrontation with the problem. Now, you can take a look at this basic overview of the other aspects or elements within the larger three-act structure, but keep in mind that basic framework for narrative, that being setup, confrontation, and resolution. In the next video, we'll be taking a look at some of the techniques and devices that authors can use in the context of, let's say, a nonfiction article that deals with the medical issue, like the harvesting of organs or organ donation, and the way in which those techniques can render this work more palatable and appealing to readers. In so doing, then, it necessarily shapes the way in which those readers are going to respond. We'll talk more about that in the next video.